Hello and welcome back to the Crime Folio. We are gathered here once more to peer into the abyss, exploring the chilling chronicles of true crime. Tonight, our journey takes us into the unsettling territory of the stalker's psyche. We will explore the fragile line that separates admiration from obsession, fantasy from reality. It is a path that begins in the quiet corners of the mind, fueled by delusion and a desperate need for connection, but one that too often ends in a violent, tragic collision with the real world. From obsession to murder, these are the stories of when a fan's love becomes fatal. Case 1. The Murder of Rebecca Schaefer. Our story begins not in darkness, but in light. It begins with a smile that could illuminate a room and a spirit filled with the boundless optimism of youth. Rebecca Lucille Schaefer was born in Eugene, Oregon, in 1967. From an early age, she was a magnetic presence, intelligent, ambitious, and possessing a natural charisma that seemed to draw people in. She dreamed of a life beyond her quiet hometown, a life on a grander stage. By her mid-teens, that dream began to materialize. She started modeling, her striking features gracing the pages of teen magazines. But her ambition was set on acting. In 1984, at just 17 years old, she convinced her parents to let her move to New York City to pursue her craft. It was a bold move, but one that quickly paid off. After a short stint in a daytime soap opera, she landed the role that would make her a household name. In 1986, Rebecca was cast as Patricia Patty Russell in the CBS sitcom My Sister Sam. The show was a success, and Rebecca, with her effervescent charm and girl-next-door appeal, became its breakout star. She was on the cover of 17 magazine. A familiar, friendly face beamed into millions of homes every week. To the world, she was Patty sweet, innocent, and completely accessible. This public persona, an image of wholesome purity, was meticulously crafted by the television industry. It was also the very thing that would, in the end, seal her fate. For in the audience, watching her every move, was a mind that could not distinguish the character from the actress. A mind that was beginning to fracture under the weight of its own obsession. That mind belonged to Robert John Bardo. Born in 1970, Bardo's life was a stark contrast to Rebecca's. He was the youngest of 7 children, raised in a troubled home in Tucson, Arizona. His childhood was marked by allegations of abuse, academic failure, and a growing detachment from reality. He was a quiet, withdrawn boy who found more comfort in fantasy than in the world around him. He was institutionalized several times, treated for emotional problems, and was known to have threatened violence against others. He dropped out of high school and drifted between menial jobs, his life lacking any direction or purpose. Instead, he poured all of his energy, all of his focus, into a series of intense, one-sided relationships with female celebrities. Before Rebecca, there was Samantha Smith, the young peace activist who had famously written to the Soviet leader Yuri Andropov. Bardo became fixated on her, even traveling to Maine in an attempt to meet her. But after Samantha's tragic death in a plane crash in 1985, Bardo's obsessive gaze needed a new anchor. He found it in Rebecca Schaefer. He began to watch My Sister Sam religiously. In his mind, Rebecca was not an actress playing a part. She was Patty Russell. She was his. He started writing her letters, dozens of them, sent to the studio where the show was filmed. At first, they were typical fan letters, filled with admiration and praise. Rebecca, known for her kindness, even sent him a signed photograph in return. To her, it was a simple, professional courtesy. To Bardo, it was a sign. It was proof of a special connection, a personal bond that existed only in his imagination. He believed she was reciprocating his love. His obsession deepened. He recorded every episode of her show, compiling a library of her on-screen life. The line between television and reality had completely dissolved for him. In 1987, his fantasy demanded a physical presence. He traveled to Los Angeles, carrying a bouquet of flowers and a large teddy bear. He went to the Warner Brothers studio where My Sister Sam was filmed and tried to get onto the set to see her. He was, of course, turned away by security. He was told he needed a ticket, an invitation, something he did not have. He was an outsider. The rejection was a blow, but it did not deter his obsession. It only made him more determined. He returned to Tucson, but his fixation on Rebecca continued to fester. The cancellation of My Sister Sam in 1988 was a turning point. With Rebecca no longer on television every week, Bardo's primary link to his fantasy world was severed. He grew more agitated. He began to feel that her career was stalling, and in his deluded mind, he believed it was his duty to help her, to guide her back to stardom. But then came the event that would twist his obsession into a violent, vengeful rage. He managed to obtain a copy of the film on VHS and watched the scene over and over. His pure, innocent Patty had been sullied. In his eyes, she had become just another Hollywood whore, a fallen idol who had betrayed the pure image he held of her. His love curdled into hate. The fantasy had shattered, and what rushed in to fill the void was a cold, methodical desire for punishment. She had to pay for destroying his dream. He decided he would kill her. This was not an impulsive thought. It was a calculated plan. Bardo's obsession now had a new, sinister purpose. He tried to purchase a handgun in Arizona but was turned away by the gun store clerk, who found his demeanor unsettling. Undeterred, he gave his older brother $250 to buy a Ruger GP 100.357 Magnum revolver for him. His brother, unaware of his true intentions, made the purchase. With the weapon secured, Bardo needed one final, crucial piece of information: Rebecca's home address. In a move that now seems shockingly simple, and one that would have terrifying implications for privacy laws, Bardo hired a private investigation agency in Tucson. For a fee of $250, the agency contacted the California Department of Motor Vehicles, DMV. At the time, DMV records were publicly accessible. The agency simply filled out a form, paid a small fee, and received Rebecca Schaefer's home address in West Hollywood. There were no background checks, no questions asked. The system designed for mundane administrative tasks had become an unwitting accomplice in a murder plot. With a gun in his possession and her address in his pocket, Bardo boarded a bus to Los Angeles. He carried with him a copy of J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye, the same book that had been found with Mark David Chapman after he murdered John Lennon, another celebrity stalker Bardo idolized. He saw himself as an avenging angel, a righteous punisher of a corrupt world. On the morning of July 18, 1989, Bardo arrived at Rebecca's apartment building in the West Hollywood area. It was a charming, Spanish-style building with a secure entrance. He buzzed the intercom. When Rebecca's voice came through, he told her he was a fan who had sent her a letter. Rebecca, likely used to such encounters and perhaps not wanting to be rude, came down to the security door. She spoke to him for a few minutes. He showed her the letter and the autographed photo she had sent him years earlier. By Bardo's own account, the interaction was brief and polite. Rebecca told him she was busy and needed to prepare for an important audit Iona role that could have been the next major step in her career, a role in The Godfather Part 3. She asked him not to come to her home again, shook his hand, and went back inside. For a moment, Bardo felt a flicker of something other than rage. He later told a psychologist that her kindness in that moment almost made him change his mind. He walked away from the building and went to a nearby diner for breakfast. But as he sat there, the anger returned, seething and insistent. He felt that she had been dismissive, that her handshake was a brush off. His sense of rejection, the core of his personality, flared up once more. He had come all this way to punish her for her betrayal, and he would not be denied. He finished his meal and walked back to the apartment building. It was around 10:15 a.m. He rang the bell again. Rebecca, likely annoyed but still without any sense of the mortal danger she was in, opened the security door again. Her expression, according to Bardo, was one of irritation. "You came back," she said, her voice filled with a weary frustration that any person, public figure or not, would feel at such an intrusion. For Bardo, this was the final insult. Her annoyance shattered the last remnants of his fantasy. She wasn't his Patty. She wasn't even a fallen idol. She was just a person who found him to be a nuisance. In that moment, he saw her not with adoration or even righteous anger, but with cold, empty hatred. He didn't say a word. He simply raised the .357 Magnum he had concealed in a paper bag and fired a single shot into her chest at point-blank range. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the quiet street. Rebecca screamed, "Why? Why?" and collapsed in the doorway of her building. Bardo turned and fled, not with the panic of a common criminal, but with the chilling composure of someone who had just completed a mission. A neighbor, hearing the scream and the shot, rushed out to find Rebecca bleeding on the ground. Paramedics were called, and she was rushed to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, but the damage from the single, powerful round was catastrophic. 30 minutes after arriving, Rebecca Schaefer, the bright star from Oregon, was pronounced dead. She was 21 years old. The manhunt for her killer was immediate, but it did not last long. The next day, Bardo was found wandering aimlessly through traffic in his hometown of Tucson, shouting that he had killed Rebecca Schaefer. He confessed immediately, showing no remorse. To him, the murder was a logical conclusion. He told police that the scene from her movie had ruined his image of her. He felt that if he couldn't have her, no one could. His confession was a chilling window into the mind of an erotomanic stalker person who suffers from the delusion that another person, usually a stranger of a higher social status, is in love with them. When that delusion is shattered, the love can violently transform into hate. During his trial, Bardo's defense attorneys argued that he was mentally ill, but prosecutors painted a picture of a calculated, methodical killer. They presented his letters, the purchase of the gun, and his hiring of a private investigator as evidence of premeditation. The court-appointed psychiatrist who interviewed him said Bardo claimed the murder was necessary to stop her from becoming another Hollywood slut. He was found guilty of first-degree murder in 1991 and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He remains incarcerated to this day, a hollowed-out vessel of a life consumed by fantasy. The murder of Rebecca Schaefer was more than just a personal tragedy. It was a cultural shockwave. It exposed the terrifying vulnerability of public figures in an era before the internet made everyone accessible. The fact that her killer had obtained her address so easily from a government agency sent a chill through Hollywood and beyond. In the aftermath, a profound change occurred. Stars began to hire personal security guards, and studios beefed up their on-set protection. The casual accessibility that had defined a generation of celebrities vanished overnight. More importantly, Rebecca's death became a catalyst for legal reform. Her mother, Dana Schaefer, became a fierce advocate for safety and privacy. In 1990, California passed the nation's first anti-stalking law, making it a specific crime to willfully and repeatedly follow or harass another person and make a credible threat of violence. This legislation became a model for other states and, eventually, the federal government. In 1994, the Driver's Privacy Protection Act was passed, a federal law that restricts public access to personal information from state DMV records. Rebecca Schaeffer's life was cut short by a fantasy that turned lethal. She was a victim of a system that failed to protect her and a culture that sold an image of accessibility without considering the dangers. Yet, in her tragic death, a powerful legacy was born. The laws enacted in her name have saved countless lives, creating a legal shield against the kind of obsessive behavior that killed her. She is remembered not just as the smiling face from television, but as the woman whose senseless murder forced society to finally recognize the deadly reality of a stalker's psyche. Case 2. The John Bardo Case. To understand the tragedy of Rebecca Schaeffer's death, we must turn our gaze from the vibrant life that was extinguished to the vacant space from which the violence emerged. We must examine the life of the man who pulled the trigger, not to elicit sympathy, but to trace the origins of the poison. The story of Robert John Bardo is a case study in the anatomy of obsession, a slow, creeping decay of the mind where fantasy devours reality, leaving only a hollowed-out shell driven by a singular, deadly purpose. Robert John Bardo was born in 1970, the youngest of 7 children. His father was a non-commissioned officer in the Air Force, a figure who reportedly brought a military rigidity into the home. His mother, by many accounts, was overwhelmed. From the outside, it was a large, seemingly normal family. But within its walls, a young Robert was already beginning to drift away. He was described as unusually quiet, intelligent but socially inept. He lived inside his own head, finding the world of his imagination far more comforting and controllable than the one outside his door. His school years were a chronicle of failure and isolation. Despite possessing above-average intelligence, he struggled academically. He was an outcast, a target for bullies, which only pushed him further inward. He found it impossible to forge the normal bonds of friendship. Instead, his emotional energy, which had no healthy outlet, began to curdle into something else. In his early teens, the first clear warning signs of severe mental disturbance began to surface. He threatened to take his own life. He made threats of violence against others. In one instance, he sent a letter to his school, Pueblo Magnet High, threatening a mass shooting. This led to his first significant psychiatric intervention. He was placed in a mental health facility for a month. The diagnosis was not clear-cut, but the symptoms painted a portrait of a deeply troubled young man. He exhibited traits of schizotypal and borderline personality disorders, conditions characterized by severe social anxiety, paranoid ideation, and an unstable sense of self. He was released, but the underlying illness was never cured. It was merely managed, pushed back below the surface where it continued to mutate. He dropped out of high school in the 9th grade and took on a series of menial jobs, including a position as a janitor at a Jack in the Box. These jobs never lasted. The real world, with its demands and social nuances, was a landscape he could not navigate. His failures there only reinforced his retreat into fantasy. It was in this fantasy world that his obsessions took root. Before Rebecca Schaeffer, there was Samantha Smith. In the mid-1980s, Samantha was a national symbol of innocence and hope. A young girl from Maine, she had written a letter to the Soviet leader about her fears of nuclear war and was subsequently invited to the Soviet Union. She became a media darling, a junior ambassador. For Bardo, she was the perfect object of fixation. Pure, non-threatening, and existing at a safe distance on a television screen. He began to write her letters. His obsession grew until it compelled him to act. He took a bus to Maine, determined to find her, to make his fantasy real. He was located by police, wandering near her home, and sent back to Arizona. The barrier between his world and hers had held. Then, in 1985, Samantha Smith died in a plane crash. For a stable mind, this would be a sad news story. For Bardo, it was a personal catastrophe. The anchor of his fantasy was gone. A void opened up and it needed to be filled. He found his new anchor in Rebecca Schaeffer. When the sitcom My Sister Sam premiered in 1986, Bardo was 16 years old. In the character of Patty Russell, he found a perfect replacement for Samantha Smith. Rebecca, playing Patty, projected an image of wholesome, girl-next-door innocence. She was vibrant, funny, and seemingly attainable. The television screen became Bardo's portal. He began his ritual again, but with a new intensity. He wrote her letter after letter, pouring his delusional affections onto the page. When her agent, following standard procedure, sent back a signed 8 by 10 photograph, Bardo interpreted it as a deeply personal response. In his mind, this was not a form letter. It was a confirmation. She knew him. She was reciprocating his love. This is a classic symptom of erotomanic delusion. The unshakable belief that another person is secretly in love with you. The delusion needed more fuel. He recorded every episode of the show. He created a shrine to her in his room. His world shrank until it contained only himself and the object of his obsession. In 1987, the delusion demanded proximity. He traveled to Los Angeles. Armed with a large teddy bear and a bouquet of flowers, he went to the Warner Brothers studio. This was not just a fan hoping for a glimpse of a star. This was a man on a mission to unite with the person he believed was his soulmate. When the studio security guards turned him away, it was more than a simple rejection. It was a profound invalidation of his entire reality. The world was conspiring to keep them apart. He returned to Tucson, defeated but not deterred. The obsession was now tinged with the bitterness of resentment. He continued to write, his letters reportedly taking on a more demanding, unsettling tone. He felt that Rebecca's career, after the cancellation of My Sister Sam, was not progressing as it should. In his mind, he was her guide, her protector. He knew what was best for her. This sense of ownership, this belief that he had the right to control her life and her choices, is a hallmark of the stalker's psyche. The victim is no longer a person. They are a possession, an extension of the stalker's own ego. During this period, Bardo's inner world was also being shaped by other dark influences. He became fixated on the U2 song Exit from their album, The Joshua Tree. The song is a dark, churning narrative about a man who descends into violence, driven by a twisted, religious fervor. Bardo reportedly listened to the song repeatedly. He saw himself in its lyrics, a man with a hands of love, who felt compelled to commit a righteous, terrible act. He was also deeply interested in the story of Mark David Chapman, the man who had murdered John Lennon. Chapman was not just a killer to him. He was a figure to be emulated, another man who had punished a celebrity for perceived sins. The final, catastrophic trigger was the 1989 film scenes from the class struggle in Beverly Hills. When Bardo saw Rebecca in a scene where she was in bed with a male actor, his fragile psychological world shattered completely. This is a crucial moment to understand. It was not simple jealousy. It was a violation of the Madonna whore complex that dominated his thinking. He had placed Rebecca on a pedestal of absolute purity. She was his innocent Patty, his untouchable Madonna. By taking on a mature sexual role, by behaving as a normal adult woman and a professional actress, she had, in his eyes, fallen from grace. She had betrayed him and the perfect image he had constructed. The love did not just fade. It inverted with terrifying speed. All the obsessive energy he had poured into adoring her now became focused on destroying her. She was no longer a pure angel but a Hollywood whore who needed to be punished. His mission was no longer to unite with her, but to cleanse the world of her perceived corruption. His actions from this point forward reveal a chilling methodicalness. This was not a crime of passion in the heat of the moment. It was a premeditated execution. His attempt to buy a gun himself was thwarted, but he showed cunning by manipulating his brother into purchasing the weapon for him. His decision to hire a private investigator was a cold, logical step. He used the systems of the real world, the world he otherwise couldn't function in, to achieve his deadly fantasy goal. The fact that he obtained her home address from the California DMV for a small fee highlights a terrifying systemic vulnerability, but it also showcases Bardo's goal-oriented determination. His journey to Los Angeles was a pilgrimage of death. He carried the catcher in the rye, consciously linking himself to his idol Mark David Chapman. He was not just a killer. He was an avenger, a righteous figure in his own twisted narrative. The morning of July 18, 1989, played out as he had planned. His first interaction with Rebecca at her apartment door is a haunting detail. He later told his psychiatrist that when she politely asked him to leave and shook his hand, he was momentarily disarmed. He almost abandoned his plan. This reveals that there was a flicker of choice, a moment when he could have stepped back from the abyss. But his ego, his lifelong sense of rejection and inadequacy, was too powerful. He walked to a diner, and as he sat there, the feeling of being brushed off festered. Her simple, reasonable request to be left alone was, in his mind, the ultimate insult. Confirmed his worthlessness. And if he was worthless, she had to be the one to pay the price. He walked back to her apartment. When she opened the door the second time, her expression of annoyance was the final nail in her coffin. She was not his Patty. She was not a goddess. She was just a woman who was tired of his intrusions. And for that, she had to die. He raised the gun and fired. Her scream of why, was a question he could never answer in a way the sane world would understand. For him, the reason was obvious. She had broken the rules of his fantasy. His flight from the scene was not panicked. He had accomplished his mission. When he was arrested the next day in Tucson, he confessed immediately and without remorse. His statements to police were a direct window into his delusion. He spoke of how she had to be stopped from becoming another Hollywood slut. He saw his act as a necessity. During his trial, the central question was his sanity. His defense detailed his long and documented history of mental illness. The prosecution, however, pointed to the clear evidence of premeditation. The gun, the private investigator, the travel, the emulation of Mark David Chapman. He may have been mentally ill, they argued, but he was not legally insane. He understood that his actions were wrong. He simply felt they were justified. The court agreed with the prosecution. Robert John Bardo was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the end, he is a tragic figure not because we should feel sorry for him, but because he represents a catastrophic failure at every level. A failure of family to see the depth of the problem, a failure of the mental health system to contain it, and a failure of an individual mind to distinguish right from wrong, love from possession, and reality from a deadly, all-consuming fantasy. The case of John Bardo is a chilling reminder that behind the act of stalking is a psyche where the lines have not just been blurred, but erased entirely. Case 3. The Murder of Dominique Dunne. The stalker's psyche does not always operate from a distance, nurtured by the glow of a television screen. Sometimes, it festers in the closest of quarters, in the intimate space between two people, can disguise itself as love, as passion, as protection. But beneath the surface, it is the same pathology. A desperate need for control, an obsession that cannot tolerate rejection, and a rage that ignites when that control is lost. The story of Dominique Dunne is a devastating chronicle of how this intimate form of obsession can escalate from a fairy tale romance to a horrifying, deliberate act of annihilation. Dominique Ellen Dunne was born into a world of words and celluloid. She was the daughter of Dominic Dunne, a writer, producer, and later a renowned investigative journalist, and the niece of acclaimed novelists John Gregory Dunne and Joan Didion. She grew up surrounded by the creative energy of Hollywood, and it was natural that she would be drawn to its light. She was talented, beautiful, and possessed a vulnerability that was magnetic on screen. After studying acting and appearing in a series of television productions, she landed the role that would make her an instantly recognizable face. Dana Freeling, the elder sister in the 1982 blockbuster horror film Poltergeist. The film was a massive success, and at 22 years old, Dominique Dunne was on the cusp of major stardom. Her future seemed limitless, a bright path stretching out before her. In 1981, at a party, she met John Thomas Sweeney. On the surface, he was the perfect match for a rising Hollywood star. He was tall, handsome, and charismatic, the head chef at Ma Maison, one of Los Angeles's most exclusive and fashionable restaurants. He moved with confidence and charmed those around him. Theirs was a whirlwind romance, a seemingly glamorous pairing. They moved into a small house together on Rangeley Avenue in West Hollywood. To the outside world, they were a vibrant, attractive couple living the quintessential LA dream. But inside the walls of that house, a different story was unfolding. The dream was rapidly becoming a nightmare. Sweeney's charm was a carefully constructed facade that concealed a deeply insecure and violently possessive nature. His adoration for Dominique was not the supportive love of a partner. It was the suffocating grip of an owner. The first signs were subtle, classic indicators of coercive control. He became intensely jealous. He criticized her career, her ambition. He hated when she rehearsed scenes is much closer. It sleeps in your bed, dines at your table, and holds your hand, masking a terrifying possessiveness behind a veneer of love. The obsession is not born of distance and fantasy, but of proximity and a suffocating need for control. When that control is challenged, the response can be just as deadly. This was the tragedy of Dominique Dunne, a young actress whose rising star was extinguished not by a deranged fan, but by the man she had loved. Dominique Ellen Dunne was born into a world of words and cinema. She was the daughter of Dominic Dunne, a film producer and writer, and the niece of acclaimed authors John Gregory Dunne and Joan Didion. Hollywood was not a distant dream for her. It was the family business. Yet she was determined to make her own way. After studying acting and honing her craft in stage productions, she began to land television roles in the late 1970s and early 1980s, appearing in popular shows like Lou Grant and Fame. She possessed a delicate beauty, but it was her expressive, soulful eyes that captured the audience's attention. They conveyed a vulnerability and an old-soul wisdom that belied her years. In 1982, she landed the role that would cement her place as a promising new talent. She was cast as Dana Freeling, the teenage daughter in the Steven Spielberg-produced, Tobe Hooper-directed horror classic Poltergeist. The film was a blockbuster, and Dominique's performance was praised. She was on the cusp of a major career, a bright future stretching out before her. She was 22 years old, living in a small home of her own in West Hollywood, savoring her newfound independence and success. In 1981, at a party, she met John Thomas Sweeney. He was not a part of the Hollywood scene, but he was successful and charismatic in his own right. Sweeney was the head chef at Ma Maison, one of the most exclusive and fashionable restaurants in Los Angeles. He was handsome, charming, and exuded an air of confidence. To Dominique and her friends, he seemed like a perfect match. He was a man with his own established career, seemingly unthreatened by her growing fame. They fell into a whirlwind romance. Within weeks, they were living together in the small house she had just rented. On the surface, they were a golden couple. But beneath the glamorous exterior, A dark and dangerous dynamic was taking hold. Sweeney's charm was a mask for a deep-seated insecurity and a volatile, possessive jealousy. He began to resent the attention she received. He was with male actors, his mind twisting professional collaboration into personal betrayal. He began to isolate her. He would try to turn her against her friends and family, sowing seeds of doubt and creating drama. He wanted to be the center of her universe, the only voice she listened to, the only person she needed. His moods were volatile and unpredictable, swinging from passionate affection to cold, simmering rage. Dominique found herself walking on eggshells, constantly trying to manage his emotions, to prevent the next explosion. The vibrant, confident young woman began to shrink, to dim her own light so as not to agitate him. Soon, the emotional abuse escalated into physical violence. On August 27, 1982, they had a vicious argument. Sweeney attacked her. He grabbed her by the hair and ripped a clump of it from her scalp. She fled to her mother's house, terrified. A few days later, she returned, believing his tearful apologies, his promises that it would never happen again. It is a tragically familiar cycle for victims of domestic abuse. The violence, the remorse, the reconciliation, and the inevitable return to violence, each time worse than the last. About a month later, on September 26th, another argument erupted. This time he choked her. She later told friends she had seen spots in front of her eyes and thought she was going to die. She hid in the bathroom, and when he began to break the door down, she escaped through the window. That was the final straw. She knew she had to get out, that her life was in danger. She ended the relationship for good. She changed the locks on the West Hollywood house and began the difficult process of untangling her life from his. Sweeney, however, would not let go. The loss of control was something his psyche could not accept. The breakup was not an end. It was a challenge. He began to stalk her. He would call her incessantly at all hours. He would show up at her home, at the restaurants she went to with friends. His presence was a constant, menacing shadow. Dominique was living in fear, but she was also trying to move on. She had just been cast in the television miniseries V, a significant role that would continue her upward career trajectory. She was focused on her work, on rebuilding the life he had tried to dismantle. On the evening of October 30th, 1982, Dominique was at home, rehearsing her lines for V with her co-star, David Packer. It was a normal, professional evening, but Sweeney had other plans. He showed up at her door, demanding to speak with her, wanting to avoid a confrontation in front of Packer, and perhaps believing she could finally make him understand it was over. Dominique agreed to speak with him outside on the porch. She told Packer that if she wasn't back in a few minutes, he should call the police. Inside, Packer turned up the stereo to give them privacy, but he could still hear the muffled sounds of a heated argument. Then, he heard a sickening smack, 2 screams, and a thud. Alarmed, he went to the door and looked out through a window. He could not see them. He called the police and told them his friend was being attacked in the driveway. He then called a friend and said, "If I'm dead, John Sweeney killed me." He was terrified. He unlocked the back door to provide an escape route for himself. When he approached the front door again, he saw Sweeney's feet near a bush in the darkness. The police arrived within minutes. What they found was a scene of chilling, quiet horror. Dominique Dunn was lying unconscious on the ground. John Sweeney was standing over her. When an officer asked him what had happened, he held up his hands and said, simply, "I killed my girlfriend, and I tried to kill myself." He pointed to a bottle of pills he had swallowed in a half-hearted suicide attempt. The argument on the porch had been Sweeney's final, desperate attempt to regain control. Dominique had stood her ground, refusing to reconcile. She had told him it was over forever. In that moment of ultimate rejection, his possessiveness reached its lethal peak. He had grabbed her and begun to strangle her. According to forensic evidence, he choked her for an estimated 4 to 6 minutes, a horrifyingly long and intimate act of violence. It was not a momentary loss of control. It was a sustained, deliberate effort to extinguish her life. Dominique was rushed to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. She had been deprived of oxygen for too long. Her brain was catastrophically damaged. She never regained consciousness. For 5 days, she remained on life support, a machine breathing for a body whose mind and spirit had already been stolen. On November 4, 1982, after tests showed no brain activity, her family made the agonizing decision to remove her from life support. Dominique Dunn was dead. She was 22 years old. The murder of a beautiful, famous young actress by her celebrity chef boyfriend became a major news story. But the true horror, the second great injustice, was yet to come. It would unfold not in a dark driveway, but in a brightly lit Los Angeles courtroom. John Sweeney was charged with first-degree murder. His defense, led by attorney Michael Adelson, argued that it was not murder at all, but a crime of passion. They painted a picture of Sweeney as a heartbroken man, driven to an act of uncontrollable rage by Dominique's rejection. He didn't mean to kill her, they claimed. He just exploded. It was a classic defense strategy, designed to shift blame onto the victim and elicit sympathy for the killer. The trial was presided over by Judge Burton S. Katz. His rulings would prove to be as devastating to the cause of justice as Sweeney's actions were to Dominique's life. The prosecutor, Deputy District Attorney Stephen Barshop, wanted to introduce testimony that would establish Sweeney's pattern of violence and control. He had found a previous girlfriend of Sweeney's, Lillian Pierce, who was prepared to testify that Sweeney had also violently abused her, resulting in 10 hospitalizations. This testimony was crucial. It would have shown the jury that his attack on Dominique was not an isolated explosion, but part of a consistent, terrifying pattern of behavior with women. Inexplicably, Judge Katz ruled this testimony inadmissible. He's suspicious of her male co-stars. An acting class scene where she played a victim of abuse would send him into a rage, accusing her of enjoying the scenario. He began to isolate her from her friends, demanding to know where she was at all times. His love was not a partnership. It was an ownership. Dominique, young and in love, initially tried to placate him, to manage his moods, to keep the peace. She saw his jealousy as a sign of how much he cared. It was a fatal misinterpretation. The first major explosion of violence occurred on August 27, 1982. During an argument, Sweeney attacked her. He grabbed her by the hair, dragged her to the floor, and began to choke her. She managed to escape and fled to her mother's house. Sweeney followed her, pounding on the door, begging for forgiveness. After a few days, believing his tearful promises that it would never happen again, she returned to him. This is the tragic, well-worn pattern of the cycle of abuse. An eruption of violence, followed by a honeymoon phase of remorse and promises, lulling the victim back into a false sense of security. But the peace did not last. A month later, on September 26th, the violence returned, this time with more terrifying intensity. During another argument, he attacked her again, wrapping his hands around her neck and strangling her. She later told friends she could hear and feel herself losing consciousness, seeing spots before her eyes. When he released her, there were visible bruises on her neck. This time, the illusion was shattered. She knew her life was in danger. She fled his presence for good, taking refuge with friends and her mother. She ended the relationship definitively. But John Sweeney would not let go. His possessiveness now denied its object, morphed into classic stalking behavior. He began a relentless campaign of harassment. He would call her at all hours, alternately begging, crying, and threatening. He would show up unannounced at her home. He appeared at her workplace. He was trying to reassert the control he had lost. Dominique, terrified, changed the locks on her doors but refused to file a restraining order, reportedly fearing it would only enrage him further. She just wanted to move on with her life and her career. She had been cast in a leading role in the sci-fi miniseries V, a project that promised to elevate her career even further. On the evening of October 30th, 1982, just 4 days before her 23rd birthday, Dominique was in her West Hollywood home. She was rehearsing her lines for V with her co-star, David Packer. It was a rainy night. Suddenly, John Sweeney was there on her doorstep. He had gotten past the new locks and was demanding to speak with her. Wanting to avoid a scene in front of Packer and perhaps believing she could handle him one last time, she agreed to speak with him on the porch. Packer remained inside. He later recalled feeling uneasy and, to give them the illusion of privacy while still being close, he turned up the volume on the television. Through the door, he could hear the sounds of a heated argument. Then he heard a slap, followed by 2 screams, and a sickening thud. After that, there was an eerie silence. Worried, Packer went to the door and looked out onto the driveway. He saw Sweeney kneeling over something just out of sight behind some bushes. He called out, but Sweeney told him to call the police. Packer ran inside and dialed 911, but the operator, in a moment of catastrophic misjudgment, told him the incident was outside their jurisdiction and that he should call the local police. By the time he got through to the correct authorities, precious minutes had been lost. When police arrived, they found a chilling scene. Sweeney was standing by Dominique's unconscious body. "I killed my girlfriend," he told the officers, holding his hands up in surrender. Dominique was not dead, but she was close. Sweeney had strangled her with such sustained force that her brain had been deprived of oxygen for an estimated 4 to 6 minutes. Paramedics rushed her to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, but she never regained consciousness. She was placed on life support, a machine breathing for a body whose mind had already gone. For 5 agonizing days, her family, including her father Dominic and her brother Griffin, kept a vigil at her bedside, praying for a miracle that would not come. Brain scans confirmed there was no activity. On November 4th, 1982, Dominique Dunn was declared legally dead, and her family made the heartbreaking decision to remove her from life support. In a final act of grace, her organs were donated, her heart saving the life of a man in Utah. The murder of a beautiful, famous young actress by her handsome chef ex-boyfriend became a major news story. But the true horror of the case was yet to unfold, in the very courtroom where her family sought justice. The trial of John Sweeney began in August 1983. The Dunn family, steeped in the world of storytelling, expected a clear narrative of good versus evil, of a vulnerable victim and a brutal killer. What they encountered was a legal system that seemed determined to put the victim on trial. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Ronald Ito, who would later preside over the O.J. Simpson trial, aimed for a conviction of first-degree murder, arguing that Sweeney's relentless harassment and his final, sustained attack constituted premeditation. The defense, led by Michael Adelson, crafted a different story. Their strategy was to portray Sweeney not as a methodical killer, but as a heartbroken man who had been driven to a crime of passion. They argued that he had simply snapped in a moment of uncontrollable emotion, and that he had no memory of the act of strangling Dominique. The key to their defense was painting Dominique as a provocateur. Adelson suggested that she had led Sweeney on, that her refusal to reconcile with him on that final night was a cruel rejection that sent him over the edge. It was a classic victim-blaming strategy, and it found a receptive ear in the presiding judge, Burton S. Katz. Judge Katz made a series of rulings that systematically dismantled the prosecution's case and devastated the Dunn family. First, and most crucially, he refused to allow testimony from Lillian Pierce, a former girlfriend of Sweeney's whom he had also violently abused over a 2-year period. Pierce was prepared to testify that Sweeney had a clear and established pattern of attacking and hospitalizing her. This testimony would have shattered the defense's claim that the attack on Dominique was a unique, spontaneous snap. By ruling her testimony inadmissible, Judge Katz prevented the jury from seeing Sweeney not as a lovesick man, but as a serial abuser. Next, Judge Katz ruled that there was insufficient evidence of premeditation. He effectively took the charge of first-degree murder off the table, leaving the jury to consider only second-degree murder or the lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter. He also ruled that the initial 911 call, where the operator had given David Packer the wrong information, could not be heard by the jury. The courtroom became a theater of injustice. Sweeney took the stand and delivered a tearful, seemingly remorseful performance, claiming he couldn't remember the killing and that he still loved Dominique. The Dunn family could only watch in horror as the narrative of their daughter's murder was twisted into a story of a tragic romance gone wrong. On September 21, 1983, the verdict came in. The jury found John Sweeney not guilty of second-degree murder. They found him guilty only of the lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter. There was an audible gasp in the courtroom. Dominique Dunn, enraged, screamed at Sweeney, "You're going to pay for this, you bastard!" and was removed from the court. The sentencing was the final insult. For the brutal, sustained act of strangling a woman to death, Judge Katz sentenced John Sweeney to the maximum term allowed for voluntary manslaughter. 6 years in prison, plus 6 months for a separate assault charge. He would be eligible for parole in half that time. John Sweeney served just 3 years and 7 months of his sentence. He was released, deemed it prejudicial. He also barred Dominique's mother, Ellen Dunn, from telling the jury about Sweeney's previous assaults on her daughter, ruling that her statements were hearsay. Finally, he refused to allow David Packer to testify that Dominique had told him she was trying to end the relationship and get away from Sweeney. The judge effectively stripped the prosecution of its most powerful evidence, preventing them from showing the jury the history of abuse, control, and terror that had defined the relationship. The jury was left with a sanitized, distorted version of events. A loving couple had a bad argument, and things went tragically wrong. The context of stalking, control, and prior violence was almost entirely erased. Before the jury even began its deliberations, Judge Katz made his most controversial move. He unilaterally ruled that there was insufficient evidence of premeditation or malice to support a charge of first-degree, premeditated murder or second-degree, malicious, but not premeditated murder. He instructed the jury that they could only consider the lesser charge of manslaughter. The jury was left with no choice. On September 21, 1983, they found John Sweeney guilty of voluntary manslaughter and a misdemeanor for the earlier assault. He was acquitted of the murder charge that the judge had already thrown out. At the sentencing, Dominique's father, Dominique Dunn, read a statement. "The system of justice has been a hideous surprise to my family," he said. "The killer of my daughter is still a killer." Judge Katz sentenced John Sweeney to the maximum possible sentence for the conviction. 6 years in prison for manslaughter, plus 6 months for the misdemeanor assault. John Thomas Sweeney, the man who deliberately strangled the life out of Dominique Dunn over a period of several minutes, was released on parole after serving only 3.5 years. The verdict and the sentence were a profound insult to Dominique's memory and a terrifying message to victims of domestic violence everywhere. The legal system had failed her. It had prioritized the rights of her killer over her right to life, and it had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of his crime. Sweeney was not just a spurned lover. He was a stalker and a controller. His violence was the ultimate expression of that control. When he could no longer possess her in life, he chose to possess her in death. After his release, Sweeney, a man convicted of a violent killing, immediately got a job as a chef at another high-end restaurant in Santa Monica. Dominic Dunn, devastated and enraged, organized protests. He and other members of Dominic's family, along with their supporters, stood outside the restaurant handing out flyers to patrons that read, "The hands that will prepare your meal tonight also murdered Dominic Dunn." Sweeney was soon fired. He changed his name to John Mora and moved away, disappearing into a new life. But the story does not end there. The injustice of the trial ignited a fire in Dominic Dunn. He channeled his grief and rage into his work, writing a searing, detailed account of the trial for Vanity Fair magazine titled Justice, a father's account of the trial of his daughter's killer. The article brought national attention to the case and the shocking failures of the justice system. It became a landmark piece of journalism that exposed how the courts often re-victimized the families of the murdered. Dominic's mother, Ellen "Lenny" Dunn, founded the California Center for Victims of Violent Crime, an advocacy group that would later be renamed Justice for Homicide Victims. The case became a catalyst in the burgeoning victims' rights movement, highlighting the desperate need for legal reforms, such as allowing testimony about a defendant's prior history of abuse. The murder of Dominic Dunn stands as a stark and painful lesson. It demonstrates that the stalker's psyche is not limited to strangers and fans. It can thrive in the heart of a relationship, disguised as love but functioning as a prison. It is a pathology of ownership. John Sweeney did not kill Dominic in a moment of passion. He killed her because she dared to claim her own freedom. Her death was the tragic, foreseeable culmination of a campaign of terror and control, a campaign the justice system of from prison in 1986. The murder of Dominic Dunn and the subsequent travesty of justice had a profound and lasting impact. It galvanized her father, Dominic Dunn, who chronicled the entire ordeal in a powerful, heartbreaking article for Vanity Fair titled Justice, a father's account of the trial of his daughter's killer. The article launched his second career as a celebrated journalist, covering crimes of the rich and powerful, always with an eye for the victims the system had forgotten. The case also led to the formation of support groups like Parents of Murdered Children, giving a voice to families who felt silenced by the legal system. It starkly illuminated how domestic violence was viewed at the time not as a pattern of coercive control culminating in murder, but as a private, passionate affair that had simply gone too far. John Sweeney was not a classic stalker in the mold of a stranger obsessed from afar, but his psyche was identical. He believed Dominic was his possession. He could not accept her autonomy. When she asserted her right to leave, to be free, he responded with the ultimate act of control: erasure. Her story is a chilling reminder that the deadliest obsessions can often be the ones we invite into our homes. Case 4. The Ricardo Lopez stalking of Bjork. The stalker's violence can erupt from the intimacy of a shared home, as it did with Dominic Dunn. But it can also gestate in the profound isolation of a solitary room, thousands of miles away, nurtured by nothing more than images on a screen and a voice from a speaker. This is the story of an obsession that never involved a single touch, a single shared word, or a single moment of physical proximity, yet culminated in one of the most meticulously documented and terrifying descents into madness in the annals of stalking. It is the story of Ricardo Lopez and the star who became the sun in his dark, lonely universe, Bjork. Ricardo Lopez was born in Uruguay in 1975 and moved to the United States with his family, settling in a middle-class suburb in Hollywood, Florida. On the surface, His was a life of quiet normalcy. He was intelligent, articulate, and by all accounts, a gentle and unassuming young man. He had aspirations of becoming an artist, but a crippling social anxiety and a deep-seated feeling of inadequacy prevented him from pursuing this dream in any meaningful way. He felt disconnected from his peers, unable to form romantic relationships or lasting friendships. He was, in his own words, a loser, a eunuch. He dropped out of high school and retreated into himself, taking a job as a pest exterminator for his brother's business. His life was small, routine, and crushingly lonely. He lived in a small, sparsely furnished apartment, a sterile box that became both his sanctuary and his prison. It was here, within these four walls, that he built his real world, a world of fantasy, of art, and of obsession. In 1993, at the age of 18, he discovered the Icelandic singer Björk. Björk Guðmundsdóttir was not a conventional pop star. She was an avant-garde artist, an innovator whose music was a strange and beautiful fusion of electronica, pop, and experimental soundscapes. Her public persona was one of pixie-like eccentricity, of fierce creative independence, and of a deep, almost primal connection to nature. To a lonely young man who felt like an outcast, she was more than just a singer. She was a revelation. He saw in her a kindred spirit, another person who didn't fit into the mundane world. She was pure, she was brilliant, she was everything he was not. She became his muse. His fascination quickly spiraled into a pathological obsession. It was not a passing crush. It was a full-time occupation. He began to compile an exhaustive dossier on her life. He read every article, watched every interview. He learned about her childhood, her musical influences, her philosophies. His goal, he wrote, was to understand the Björk life philosophy. He began to keep a diary, a sprawling 803-page testament to his fixation. In its pages, he documented not only his thoughts on Björk, but also his own profound self-loathing, his sexual frustrations, and his feelings of alienation. The diary was his only confidant. He wrote about his fantasies of inventing a time machine so he could travel back and become her childhood friend. He fantasized about being a famous artist himself so that he could be worthy of her, so they could have a chat about art. He referred to her as his little miracle. This adoration, however, was built on a dangerously fragile foundation: the idea of her absolute purity. In his mind, she was a celestial being, untouched by the ugliness of the world. He was in love not with a person, but with an idea, an idol he had constructed in the isolation of his room. For 3 years, this obsession remained a private, albeit deeply unhealthy, affair. He lived vicariously through her, her music the soundtrack to his lonely existence. He would talk to her photo, sharing his day with her. The line between his reality and his fantasy was dissolving. He was no longer just Ricardo Lopez, the pest exterminator. He was the secret keeper of Björk's soul, the only one who truly understood her. Then, in mid-1996, his carefully constructed fantasy world came crashing down. He read in a magazine that Björk was in a romantic relationship with another musician, the British artist Goldie. For a stable mind, this would be a trivial piece of celebrity news. For Ricardo Lopez, it was a cataclysmic betrayal. And the fact that Goldie was a black man was, in Lopez's twisted racial ideology, the ultimate corruption. His diary entries turned venomous. The pure angel had sullied herself. The betrayal was not just romantic. It was racial. He filled his diary with racist slurs and furious, heartbroken diatribes. "I'm not a racist," he would write, and then immediately follow it with pages of vitriolic racism, a perfect illustration of a mind at war with itself. He felt that she had betrayed him personally, that she had chosen a lesser, being over the pure love he offered from afar. His love, a force that had given his life a twisted sense of purpose, instantly curdled into a white-hot hatred. The obsessive energy that had been focused on adoration now needed a new outlet. It found its purpose in revenge. If he could not have her, he would punish her. He wanted to make a permanent mark on her life, to connect them forever through an act of violence. He decided he would not kill her. That would be too quick, too merciful. He wanted to destroy the thing he had once worshipped, her beauty. He wanted to make her face reflect the ugliness he now saw in her soul. His new project, as he called it, was the construction of an acid bomb. He began his research with the same meticulous detail he had once applied to studying Bjork's life. He studied chemistry and explosives. He chose sulfuric acid as his weapon, a substance that would cause horrific, disfiguring burns. He then began to design the delivery mechanism. He hollowed out a large book, creating a hidden compartment. Inside, he built a device designed to spray the acid into the face of whoever opened it. It was a work of diabolical ingenuity. In January 1996, Lopez had stopped working as an exterminator and began to document his final project on video. He bought a camera and set it up in his apartment. Over the next 9 months, he would record approximately 22 hours of video diaries. These tapes are a chilling, unprecedented window into the final stages of a stalker's psychological collapse. The videos show Lopez in his bare apartment. He speaks directly to the camera, as if speaking to a confidant, or perhaps to Bjork herself. He calmly, almost academically, describes the progress of his bomb-making. He talks about his pain, his loneliness, his broken heart. He weeps, he rages, he speaks with a chilling, detached clarity. He refers to the bomb as his revenge. He saw it as a work of art, a final, terrible masterpiece. "I'm just taking her to hell with me," he says in one video, his voice flat and emotionless. "And we'll be together." He laid out his plan. He would mail the acid bomb to Bjork's home in London. He carefully crafted the packaging, using a fake return address for her record label, Elektra Records, to ensure it would not be treated as suspicious fan mail. Once he had mailed the package, his part in the physical world would be over. He would then complete the final act of his plan, his own suicide. He did not want to live in a world where Bjork was impure. His death would be the ultimate artistic statement, a final, grand gesture to prove the depth of his love and his pain. He wanted to be united with her not in life, but in infamy. On September 12, 1996, his project was complete. The bomb was sealed within the book was sealed in a package, and he was ready for the final act. He turned on his camera for the last time. The final video is one of the most disturbing documents ever recorded. He has shaved his entire head and face, a ritualistic act of purification or transformation. He then begins to paint his face. He starts with red paint, smearing it across his face and scalp. Then he adds green around his eyes and mouth, and finally, black over his lips. He looks like a grotesque tribal warrior or a death mask. He is no longer Ricardo Lopez. He is an instrument of vengeance. He puts on a Bjork song, "I Remember You," plays softly in the background. A handwritten sign is taped to the wall behind him. It reads, "The best of me, September 12th. He sits in a chair, shirtless, facing the camera. He speaks for a few moments, his voice calm. "This is for you," he says, almost as a dedication. Then he produces a .38 caliber revolver, puts the barrel in his mouth, and pulls the trigger. The camera continues to roll, capturing his lifeless body slumping in the chair as blood begins to pool on the floor behind him. The sound of the gunshot is loud, but it is the silence that follows, broken only by the gentle melody of Bjork's voice from the stereo, that is truly haunting. For 4 days, the camera recorded the gruesome scene in that silent apartment. On September 16th, residents in the building complained of a foul odor and what looked like blood leaking from Lopez's apartment. The police were called. They broke down the door and discovered Lopez's decomposed body and the 22 videotapes. As they began to watch the tapes, the horrifying reality of the situation became clear. Lopez was not just a suicide victim, he was a potential murderer. On the tapes, he had clearly stated his intention to mail an acid bomb to Bjork in London. A frantic international police operation was launched. The Hollywood, Florida police contacted Scotland Yard in London. They knew the package had been sent. They knew it was addressed to Bjork's home, where she lived with her young son, Sindri. It was a race against time. The package was already in the mail system. The London Metropolitan Police worked with the post office, frantically searching sorting facilities. Incredibly, just as the package was about to be delivered to her home, it was intercepted at a South London post office. The bomb squad was called in, and the device was safely detonated. It was, police confirmed, a viable and extremely dangerous device that would have caused severe, life-altering injuries, or even death, to whoever opened it. The news was a profound shock to Bjork. She was a fiercely private person, and the idea that a complete stranger had harbored such an intense, violent obsession with her was incomprehensible. She immediately sent a card and flowers to Lopez's grieving family. She increased her security and, for a time, retreated from the public eye, deeply shaken. In a public statement, she said, "I am very upset that someone has died. I cannot believe that I have been saved. That is a miracle. It's a very sad thing. I make music, but in other terms, people should not take me too literally and get involved in my personal life." Her words cut to the heart of the matter. Ricardo Lopez had not seen her as a musician, an artist creating a persona for public consumption. He had seen her as a literal angel, and when the human woman behind the art failed to live up to his impossible, delusional standards, he felt he had the right to enact a terrible punishment. The Ricardo Lopez case is a uniquely modern horror story. The existence of his video diaries provides an unprecedented, terrifyingly intimate view into the mind of a stalker. We are not piecing together his motives from outside evidence. We are watching him explain them himself. His story is a powerful testament to the dangers of isolation in the digital age. In his lonely room, with no real human connection to ground him, he was able to cultivate a fantasy so powerful that it completely consumed his reality. His life became a one-man show, performed for an audience of one, and his final act was a murder-suicide pact in which Bjork was an unwilling, and thankfully unharmed participant. He failed to destroy her, but in his attempt, he created a permanent, chilling legacy. A videotaped record of a mind's slow, deliberate, and ultimately self-annihilating descent into the abyss of obsession. Case 5. The assassination of John Lennon by obsessed fan Mark David Chapman. Some obsessions are born of a desire for love and connection, however twisted. Others are born of a desire for punishment and revenge. But there exists a third, perhaps more chilling category, an obsession born of a desperate, all-consuming need for significance. It is the desire not to possess the object of fixation, but to become them, to merge with them, and, when that proves impossible, to erase them, thereby stealing their fame and notoriety in a single, violent act of transference. This is the story of Mark David Chapman, a man who saw in his idol, John Lennon, a mirror of his own failures and a golden ticket to an identity he could never earn. This was not a murder for love or hate, but for fame itself. John Lennon was more than a musician. By 1980, he was a global icon, a cultural touchstone. As a member of the Beatles, he had changed the face of music and popular culture forever. After the band's tumultuous breakup, he had forged a solo career that was just as impactful, producing anthems of peace and introspection like Imagine and Instant Karma. But by the mid-1970s, he had done the unthinkable for a man of his stature. He had walked away. He retreated from public life to become a house husband, dedicating himself to raising his young son, Sean, in the sprawling, iconic Dakota apartment building overlooking New York's Central Park. For 5 years, he was a ghost, a legend living in self-imposed exile. In late 1980, he returned. Along with his wife, Yoko Ono, he released the album Double Fantasy. It was a comeback, a celebration of his domestic life, his love for his family, and his renewed creative energy. The world rejoiced. John Lennon was back. He was once again accessible, giving interviews, being photographed on the streets of New, a man who felt like a nobody. Mark David Chapman, born in 1955 in Fort Worth, Texas, was a man adrift. His life was a series of contradictions. He had been a Beatles fan as a youth, but as he grew older and embraced a fervent strain of born-again Christianity, he turned against Lennon. He was incensed by Lennon's infamous 1966 remark about the Beatles being more popular than Jesus. To Chapman, this was blasphemy. He began to see Lennon as a phony, a hypocrite who preached peace and love from his millionaire's fortress. Yet, at the same time, he remained deeply fascinated by him. He even married a Japanese-American woman, Gloria Abe, a fact he later admitted was influenced by Lennon's marriage to Yoko Ono. He was trapped in a bizarre cycle of idolization and condemnation. Chapman's life was riddled with failure. He had drifted through jobs, struggled with mental health issues, and even attempted suicide. He felt invisible, a non-entity in a world that celebrated fame and success. He developed a profound, obsessive connection to J.D. Salinger's novel, The Catcher in the Rye. He saw himself in its protagonist, Holden Caulfield, another alienated young man railing against the phonies of the adult world. He began to dress like Caulfield, to talk like him. He even signed his name as Holden Caulfield. The character was not just an inspiration. It was an identity he could adopt, a mask for his own emptiness. In this fractured state of mind, John Lennon and Holden Caulfield began to merge. Lennon, with his immense wealth and his pleas for a world with no possessions, became the ultimate phony in Chapman's eyes. And Chapman, as the self-appointed Holden Caulfield, felt it was his duty to expose him, to erase this grand hypocrisy from the world. But his motive was deeper and more selfish than mere righteous anger. He later confessed that he felt by killing John Lennon, he would absorb his fame. The world would no longer see Mark David Chapman, the nobody. They would see the man who killed John Lennon. His identity would be forever fused with his victims. It was a shortcut to significance, a murder designed to steal the spotlight. In October of 1980, Chapman quit his job as a security guard in Hawaii, bought a .38 caliber Charter Arms revolver, and flew to New York City. His plan was already forming. He stood outside the Dakota for several days, but in a moment of indecision, or perhaps a fleeting return to sanity, he abandoned the plan and flew home. The obsession, however, was too powerful to be denied. It was a voice in his head, a constant nagging command. 2 months later, in early December, he returned to New York. The command was now clear and unwavering. On the morning of December 8, 1980, he left his room at the Sheraton Hotel, leaving behind personal belongings, including a copy of Double Fantasy. He purchased a copy of The Catcher in the Rye from a bookstore and wrote inside the cover, "This is my statement." Then he went to the Dakota. He spent the entire day standing across the street, a solitary figure watching the entrance to the famous building. He was a fan among fans, indistinguishable from the others who often gathered there hoping for a glimpse of the famous resident. Around 5 p.m. his moment came. John Lennon and Yoko Ono emerged from the building, heading to a recording session. As Lennon walked past him, Chapman, quiet and unassuming, held out a copy of the Double Fantasy album. "Mr. Lennon?" he said. Lennon, known for his accessibility and kindness to his fans, stopped. He took the album and the pen Chapman offered and signed it. "Is that all you want?" Lennon asked kindly. Chapman nodded, a faint smile on his face. The moment was captured in a now famous photograph by another fan, Paul Gorish. It is a chilling image. The killer and the victim, standing together in a moment of quiet exchange, just hours before the end. Lennon and Ono left in their limousine. Chapman remained. The doorman at the Dakota, Jose Perdomo, asked him, "Are you still waiting?" Chapman replied, "Yes." He had the autograph. He could have left. The act of meeting his idol, of receiving a moment of his time, could have satisfied the obsession. But it didn't. The mission was not about connection. It was about annihilation. He later said that after Lennon signed the album, a voice in his head said, "Do it, do it, do it." For the next 5 hours, Chapman waited. The sun set and the New York night grew cold. He paced, clutching the signed album and his copy of The Catcher in the Rye. He could have left at any moment. He could have chosen a different path. But he was no longer in control. He was an actor in a play he had written for himself, and he had to see it through to its tragic finale. Shortly before 11 p.m., Lennon and Ono's limousine pulled up to the curb. They had decided to go home for a quick dinner before returning to the studio. Yoko got out of the car first and walked toward the building's arched entrance. Lennon followed a few steps behind, carrying a set of cassette tapes. As Lennon passed him, Chapman, who was standing in the shadows of the archway, called out, "Mr. Lennon!" Lennon turned. As he did, Chapman dropped into a combat stance, a technique he had learned from police magazines. He held the .38 revolver with both hands to steady his aim and fired 5 hollow-point bullets. The shots echoed through the archway, a series of sharp, violent cracks in the cold night air. 4 of the 5 bullets struck Lennon in the back and left shoulder. "I'm shot!" he cried out, staggering forward. He stumbled up the steps to the Dakota's reception area and collapsed, scattering the cassettes he was holding. Chaos erupted. The doorman, Perdomo, wrestled the gun from Chapman's hand and kicked it away. "Do you know what you've just done?" he screamed. Chapman replied with a chilling, almost surreal calmness. "Yes," he said. "I just shot John Lennon." He did not run. He did not resist. He simply stood there, a strange, placid look on his face. He calmly took off his coat and hat, as if to make it easier for the police to identify him, and then he opened his copy of The Catcher in the Rye and began to read. He had completed his mission. He was no longer a nobody. Yoko Ono's screams of anguish filled the night. Police arrived within minutes. They found Lennon bleeding profusely on the floor and Chapman standing on the sidewalk, calmly reading his book. They arrested him without a struggle. Lennon was rushed to Roosevelt Hospital in the back of a police car, but his injuries were too severe. The hollow-point bullets had done massive damage. He had lost over 80% of his blood volume. At 11:07 p.m. on December 8, 1980, John Lennon, the poet of peace, was pronounced dead. He was 40 years old. The news spread with stunning speed, a shockwave of grief that rippled across the globe. Crowds began to gather outside the Dakota, their candles and their quiet singing of his songs a stark contrast to the violence that had just occurred. A generation that had been defined by his music was now united in mourning its loss. Mark David Chapman was charged with second-degree murder. His lawyers initially prepared an insanity defense based on his well-documented history of mental illness and his bizarre, obsessive behavior. But Chapman, in a move that stunned his own legal team, decided to plead guilty. He claimed that God had spoken to him and told him to confess. The more cynical interpretation is that he did not want a lengthy trial to overshadow his moment of fame. He wanted the story to be about him and what he had done. At his sentencing hearing, he read a passage from The Catcher in the Rye. He was given a sentence of 20 years to life in prison. He has been eligible for parole every 2 years since 2000, but he has been denied every time. At his parole hearings, he has expressed remorse, but he has also provided a chillingly clear explanation of his motives. He has admitted that he killed Lennon for the glory, to steal his fame. He felt like a nobody, and believed that by murdering one of the most famous people on earth, he would become a somebody. In a parole hearing, he told the board, "I was a very confused person at that time. I saw in him what I didn't have. I had no identity of my own. I felt that by killing John Lennon, I would become somebody." The assassination of John Lennon was a cultural turning point. It marked the death of an era, the violent end of the 1960s dream of peace and love. It also ushered in a new, darker age of celebrity. The casual accessibility that had allowed Chapman to approach Lennon and get his autograph vanished overnight. The murder exposed the terrifying vulnerability of public figures to the delusions of those who live on the fringes of society. But more than that, the case of Mark David Chapman is a profound and disturbing examination of a specific type of obsessional psyche. It was not driven by erotomania, like the killers of Rebecca Schaeffer or Bjork Stalker. It was not driven by possessive rage, like the killer of Dominique Dunn. It was driven by a void, a deep, black hole of insignificance. Chapman didn't want to love Lennon or control him. He wanted to be him, and when that was impossible, he chose to erase him. It was a murder as an act of self-creation, a desperate and pathetic attempt to write his own name into history with the blood of a giant. He succeeded, but not in the way he had hoped. He is not remembered as a somebody, but as the nobody who killed John Lennon. Case 6. Yolanda Saldivar. From fan club president to Selena's murderer. The path from admiration to obsession is a treacherous one, but it is not always walked by a distant, delusional stranger. Sometimes, the stalker is an insider, a trusted confidant who has burrowed their way into the very heart of their victim's life. They are not obsessed with an image on a screen, but with the person they work for, the friend they claim to love. Their obsession is masked by loyalty and devotion, but it is driven by the same pathologies: a desperate need for control, a parasitic attachment, and a violent rage when that control is threatened. This is the story of Yolanda Saldivar, a woman whose all-consuming love for the Tejano music superstar Selena Quintanilla Perez led her from the president of a fan club to the architect of a financial betrayal and, finally, to a murderer. Selena Quintanilla was more than a singer. She was a phenomenon. Born in Lake Jackson, Texas, in 1971, she was a musical prodigy, groomed for stardom from a young age by her father and manager, Abraham Quintanilla. With her band, Selena y Los Dinos, she shattered barriers in the male-dominated world of Tejano music, a vibrant blend of Mexican folk music, polka, and pop. Her voice was powerful and emotive. Her stage presence was electric, and her smile was infectious. She was La Reina de Tejano, the queen of Tejano music. By the mid-1990s, she was on the verge of becoming a massive international crossover star. She had won a Grammy, sold millions of albums, launched a successful clothing line, and was recording her first English-language album, Dreaming of You. She was a beloved cultural icon, not just for her music, but for her down-to-earth personality, her fierce family loyalty, and the genuine warmth she exuded. She was the girl next door who had become a queen, but she never lost her connection to her roots or her fans. That accessibility, that genuine love for her supporters, would become a fatal vulnerability. In 1991, a woman named Yolanda Saldivar entered her world. Saldivar, a 30-year-old registered nurse from San Antonio, was, by all accounts, a lonely and unremarkable woman. She had a history of obsessive behavior, including allegations of stalking a former roommate and engaging in petty theft from a previous employer. She was a woman who craved importance, who desperately wanted to be part of something bigger than her own mundane life. She found that something in Selena. Saldivar became a fervent fan. She attended concerts, bought the music, and immersed herself in the world of Selena. But just being a fan wasn't enough. She needed to be closer. She contacted Selena's father, Abraham, repeatedly, pitching him the idea of starting an official fan club. Abraham, initially hesitant, was eventually won over by her persistence and what seemed to be a genuine, professional enthusiasm. In 1991, Yolanda Saldivar became the founder and president of the Selena Fan Club. It was her dream come true. She was no longer just Yolanda the nurse. She was Yolanda, the president of Selena's fan club. She poured all of her energy into the role. She was efficient, organized, and fiercely dedicated. The fan club grew to over 5,000 members. She became a gatekeeper, the crucial link between Selena and her adoring public. She had found the importance she craved. Selena and her family were impressed. Saldivar wasn't just a fan. She seemed like a loyal, hard-working member of the team. Selena, known for her trusting nature, began to see Saldivar not just as an employee, but as a friend. She confided in her, shared secrets with her. Saldivar, in turn, showered Selena with gifts and fawning praise. Her apartment became a shrine to the singer, every surface covered with photos, posters, and memorabilia. To an outsider, it might have looked like intense admiration. In reality, it was a dangerous, parasitic attachment. Saldivar was not just supporting Selena's life, she was trying to absorb it. In 1994, Selena's career expanded. She opened 2 boutiques, called Selena Etc., in Corpus Christi and San Antonio, selling her clothing designs and offering salon services. Based on her seemingly successful management of the fan club, the Quintanilla family made a fateful decision. They promoted Yolanda Saldivar to manage the boutiques. This new role gave Saldivar exactly what she craved: more power, more proximity, and more control. She was now an integral part of Selena's business empire. She controlled inventory, managed employees, and handled the finances. She traveled with Selena, shared hotel rooms with her, and became one of the most trusted people in her inner circle. But this increased power also provided an opportunity for a darker side of her personality to emerge. Employees at the boutiques began to complain about Saldivar. They described her as possessive, manipulative, and tyrannical. She would lie to Selena to get other employees in trouble. She tried to isolate Selena from other members of her team, positioning herself as the only person the singer could truly trust. Her behavior was not that of a professional manager. It was the behavior of a stalker who had successfully infiltrated her target's life. She wasn't managing a business. She was guarding a possession. Then, the financial irregularities began. Abraham Quintanilla started receiving complaints from fan club members who had sent in their membership fees but had received nothing in return. He began to investigate and discovered that checks made out to the fan club had been cashed, but there was no record of the money. At the same time, employees from the boutiques reported that clothing was missing and that the financial records seemed to be in disarray. Abraham confronted Saldivar. She was evasive, offering a series of confusing and contradictory explanations. He then discovered that Saldivar had been embezzling money, not just from the fan club, but also from the boutiques, using a complex system of forged checks and phantom accounts. The total amount was estimated to be over $30,000. For Abraham, this was a devastating betrayal. He was furious. He confronted Saldivar again, this time with Selena present. He called her a thief and a liar and threatened to go to the police. He told her she was fired. According to witnesses, Saldivar's reaction was not one of remorse, but of cold denial. For Selena, the situation was more complicated. She was deeply hurt and disappointed, but she also couldn't believe that her trusted friend could be capable of such a betrayal. She also knew that Saldivar was in possession of crucial financial documents, bank statements, and tax records that were needed for her businesses. Saldivar claimed she had been raped in Mexico and was too distraught to deal with the paperwork, a story that was later proven to be false and likely a manipulation to gain sympathy and buy time. The loss of her position was a catastrophic blow to Yolanda Saldivar's psyche. Her identity, her entire sense of self-worth, was wrapped up in her connection to Selena. Being fired was not just the loss of a job. It was an erasure of who she was. The control she had worked so hard to establish was gone. Her obsession, stripped of its power and access, began to fester into a dangerous rage. In early March 1995, Saldivar purchased a .38 caliber Taurus Model 85 revolver. She told the store clerk she needed it for protection. In reality, she was arming herself for a final confrontation. On the evening of March 30th, 1995, Saldivar called Selena from the Days Inn motel in Corpus Christi, where she had been staying. She was hysterical, claiming again that she had been assaulted and needed Selena's help. She also promised to finally hand over the missing financial documents. Selena, ever compassionate and still needing the papers, agreed to meet her. The next morning, on March 31st, Selena drove to the Days Inn. She first took Saldivar to a local hospital, where doctors found no evidence of any assault. This was the moment the final lie was exposed. They returned to the motel, to room 158. Inside that room, the final confrontation took place. We will never know the exact words that were exchanged, but it's clear what the argument was about. Selena was finally severing the ties. She was demanding the documents and ending the relationship for good. A witness in the next room heard a woman screaming, "You bitch!" followed by a loud bang. Inside the room, as Selena turned to leave, Yolanda Saldivar raised the revolver she had purchased and fired a single shot. The bullet struck Selena in the right shoulder, severing the subclavian artery, a major blood vessel. The injury was catastrophic, causing a massive and rapid loss of blood. Despite the mortal wound, Selena's survival instinct took over. She managed to open the door and stagger out, leaving a trail of blood nearly 400 feet long as she ran towards the motel lobby, screaming for help. "Help me! Help me! I've been shot!" she cried. As she collapsed onto the floor of the lobby, the clerk asked who had shot her. With her last breaths, Selena named her killer. "Yolanda," she whispered. "Room 158. Those were her final words. By the time paramedics arrived, she had lost too much blood. Her heart had stopped. They managed to revive her temporarily, but the damage was irreversible. Selena Quintanilla Perez, the Queen of Tejano, was pronounced dead at the hospital. She was 23 years old. Back at the Days Inn, Yolanda Saldivar had locked herself in her red pickup truck in the motel parking lot. A tense, 9.5-hour standoff with police ensued. The scene was broadcast live on television. Saldivar sat in the truck, holding the gun to her own head, wailing into a cell phone to police negotiators. She was hysterical, claiming the shooting was an accident. "I didn't mean to do it. I didn't mean to do it," she cried. She claimed she was trying to kill herself and the gun just went off. Finally, as night fell, she surrendered. She was arrested and charged with the murder of Selena. Her trial was a national media event. The prosecution, led by Carlos Valdez, argued that the shooting was a deliberate, premeditated act of revenge. They painted a picture of Saldivar as a manipulative embezzler who, when she was about to be exposed and lose her position of power, chose to murder the person who was taking it all away. They argued that her purchase of the gun, her luring of Selena to the motel, and the fact that a trained nurse would know exactly where to shoot someone to cause maximum damage, all pointed to premeditation. The defense argued that the shooting was a tragic accident. They stuck to the story Saldivar had told during the standoff, that she was distraught and trying to commit suicide, and the gun had accidentally discharged when Selena tried to stop her. The jury did not believe her. They saw through the facade of the devoted fan. They saw a thief, a liar, and a killer. On October 23, 1995, they found Yolanda Saldivar guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. She will be eligible for parole in March of 2025. The murder of Selena was a profound tragedy, a cultural trauma that is still felt deeply today. It was the loss of not just a talented artist, but a beloved role model. But the case of Yolanda Saldivar is also a chilling psychological study. It reveals how the stalker's psyche can operate from the inside, cloaked in the guise of friendship and loyalty. Saldivar's obsession was not with an unattainable fantasy, but with a real person she successfully managed to isolate and control. She did not love Selena. She loved the power and identity that being close to Selena gave her. When that power was stripped away, she chose to destroy the source of it. The shooting was not an accident. It was the ultimate, final act of possession. If Yolanda Saldivar could not have Selena, then no one could. Case 7. John Hinckley Jr.'s obsession with Jodie Foster and the attempted assassination of President Reagan. The stalker's psyche is a labyrinth of distorted realities, but not all paths within it lead to the object of obsession. Sometimes the target of fixation is not the ultimate goal, but merely the audience for a far grander, more terrifying performance. The violence is not meant to possess or punish the idol, but to impress them, to force them to bear witness to a desperate act of self-creation. The crime becomes a love letter written in blood and gunpowder, a deranged attempt to become worthy of an imagined love through an act of historic infamy. This is the story of John Hinckley Jr., a man who saw a movie and decided to make it real, targeting the most powerful man in the world to win the heart of a young actress who didn't even know his name. John Hinckley Jr. was a ghost haunting the edges of his own life. Born in 1955 into a wealthy and successful family, his father was the chairman of a prominent oil and gas company. Hinckley was afforded every advantage. But wealth could not buy him purpose or connection. He was a perennial drifter, a young man consumed by a profound sense of failure and alienation. He moved aimlessly across the country, from Colorado to Texas to California, trying and failing to launch a career as a singer-songwriter. He was painfully shy, socially inept, and unable to form meaningful relationships. He was a void, an empty vessel waiting for something, anything, to fill it. In 1976, he found it. He went to a movie theater and saw Martin Scorsese's masterpiece of urban decay and psychological collapse, Taxi Driver. For most people, it was a dark, brilliant film. For John Hinckley Jr., it was a mirror and a manual. He became utterly transfixed by the film's protagonist, Travis Bickle, played by Robert De Niro. Bickle was a lonely, alienated Vietnam veteran, a cab driver floating through the neon-drenched grime of New York City, disgusted by the filth he sees around him. Hinckley didn't just sympathize with Bickle, he identified with him on a cellular level. He saw Bickle's isolation as his own. He saw Bickle's rage as his own. And most importantly, he saw Bickle's mission as his own. In the film, Bickle becomes obsessed with saving a 12-year-old child prostitute named Iris, played by a preternaturally talented Jodie Foster. To prove his worth and cleanse the world, Bickle first plots to assassinate a presidential candidate, Senator Charles Palantine. When that fails, he enacts a bloody shootout to rescue Iris from her pimps. Hinckley watched the film at least 15 times. The lines between the screen and his own life began to dissolve. He was no longer John Hinckley Jr., the failed musician. He was Travis Bickle. He began to dress like Bickle in army jackets and boots. He adopted Bickle's solitary habits, drinking peach brandy and keeping a diary filled with rambling, angst-ridden thoughts. But a Travis Bickle needs an Iris. Hinckley found his in the actress who had played her. Jodie Foster became the object of his obsession. She was not a celebrity crush. She was the linchpin of his new, cinematic reality. In 1980, when Foster enrolled as a freshman at Yale University, Hinckley saw his chance to make the fantasy real. He moved to New Haven, Connecticut, and enrolled in a Yale writing class, not to learn but simply to be in her orbit, to breathe the same air. He began a campaign of stalking that was both pathetic and deeply menacing. He slipped poems and letters under her dorm room door. He left messages for her. He even managed to get her phone number and called her, recording the conversations where she was, by all accounts, politely dismissive. To a rational mind, this utter lack of encouragement would be a clear signal to stop. To Hinckley's delusional psyche, it was simply a plot point. Iris had initially rejected Travis Bickle's attempts to save her, too. Her rejection did not deter him. It only proved that he needed to escalate. He needed a grand gesture, a historic act that would elevate him from a pathetic pest to a figure of consequence, a man worthy of her attention and love. He decided to follow the rest of Travis Bickle's script. He would assassinate a president. His first target was President Jimmy Carter. In the fall of 1980, during the presidential campaign, Hinckley began to trail Carter from city to city. On October 9th, in Nashville, Tennessee, he was arrested at the airport for illegal possession of 3 handguns. He was fined and released. His parents were notified of his arrest and his increasingly erratic behavior. They tried to get him psychiatric help, but Hinckley was resistant. The system had a chance to intervene, but the true depth and danger of his delusion went unrecognized. After Ronald Reagan won the 1980 election, Hinckley's mission simply acquired a new target. Reagan became his Senator Palantine. The plan was back on track. In the early months of 1981, Hinckley's mental state deteriorated rapidly. He was living in cheap hotels, his obsession consuming his every waking thought. He purchased a Rome RG 14.22 caliber revolver, a cheap, easily concealable weapon known as a Saturday night special. He loaded it with 6 Devastator bullets, designed to explode upon impact. His intent was not just to wound, but to annihilate. On March 30th, 1981, the day he chose for his performance, he woke up in his room at the Park Central Hotel in Washington, D.C. Before leaving, he sat down and wrote one final, chilling letter to Jodie Foster. It was never mailed, but it was found by investigators in his room, a direct confession of his motive. It read, in part, "Dear Jodie, there is a definite possibility that I will be killed in my attempt to get Reagan. This is why I am writing this letter to you. As you well know by now, I love you very much. The past 7 months I have left you dozens of poems, letters, and love messages. The reason I am going ahead with this attempt now is because I just cannot wait any longer to impress you. I've got to do something now to make you understand, in no uncertain terms, that I am doing all of this for your sake. By sacrificing my freedom and possibly my life, I hope to change your mind about me. I will admit that the reason I'm going through with this is for you and you alone. I would abandon this idea of getting Reagan in a second if I could only win your heart and live out the rest of my life with you. I love you forever, John Hinckley. The letter is a Rosetta Stone for his particular brand of madness. It was not political. It was not personal animus against Reagan. It was a theatrical act, a sacrifice on the altar of his unrequited, delusional love. With the letter written, he left the hotel and took a cab to the Washington Hilton, where President Reagan was scheduled to give a speech to the AFL-CIO. He stood in the crowd of reporters and onlookers, just another face waiting for the president to emerge. He was patient. He was ready. At 2:25 p.m., President Reagan, surrounded by his entourage of Secret Service agents, exited the hotel through a side door and walked toward his waiting limousine. He smiled and waved to the small crowd. As he reached the car, Hinckley, standing less than 15 feet away, emerged from the press line. He raised the revolver into a two-handed combat stance and, in the space of just 1.7 seconds, fired all 6 shots. The scene descended into chaos. The small, sharp cracks of the revolver were followed by screams and shouts. The first bullet struck White House Press Secretary James Brady in the head, shattering his brain tissue. The second hit D.C. police officer Thomas Delahanty in the neck. The third went wild, hitting a window across the street. The fourth struck Secret Service agent Timothy McCarthy in the abdomen as he heroically threw himself in front of the president to shield him. The fifth hit the bulletproof glass of the presidential limousine. The sixth and final bullet was the one that would change history. It ricocheted off the armored side of the limousine, flattened into the shape of a dime, and entered the president's left side, under his armpit. It broke a rib, punctured his left lung, and lodged itself less than an inch from his heart. In the immediate confusion, no one realized Reagan had been hit. Secret Service agent Jerry Parr shoved the president into the car and screamed at the driver to take off. As the car sped away, Reagan began to cough up bright, frothy, red blood, a clear sign of a lung injury. Parr, realizing the president was seriously wounded, diverted the limousine from its route to the White House and sped to the George Washington University Hospital, a decision that almost certainly saved Reagan's life. Back at the Hilton, Hinckley was immediately swarmed and pinned against a wall by a crowd of agents and police. He did not resist. He did not try to flee. He simply smiled, a strange, placid expression on his face. His performance was over. Now, he just had to wait for his audience of one to see what he had done for her. The assassination attempt sent shockwaves across the nation and the world. The country watched, horrified, as news reports showed the wounded being carried away. James Brady's injury was the most severe. He would be left permanently disabled, his life forever altered by that single piece of lead. But it was the wounding of the president that plunged the country into a state of crisis. Reagan underwent emergency surgery and, in a display of remarkable resilience and good humor that would define his public image, survived. "Honey, I forgot to duck," he famously quipped to his wife, Nancy. For Jodie Foster, the event was the beginning of a living nightmare. She was a 19-year-old college student, and suddenly her name and face were inextricably linked to a horrific act of violence. She was hounded by the media, her privacy shattered. She was forced to live under constant security. The love letter Hinckley had written was published everywhere. She became a prisoner of his obsession, a reluctant character in his sick drama. She later wrote an essay titled "Why Me?" describing the profound and terrifying impact the event had on her life. His act, meant to win her, had instead violated her life in the most public way imaginable. The trial of John Hinckley Jr. became a national spectacle. The prosecution argued that he was a sane, calculating individual who knew exactly what he was doing. But his defense team presented a mountain of psychiatric evidence detailing his long history of mental illness, his delusions, and his obsession with Taxi Driver. They argued that he was suffering from erotomania and schizophrenia, that he was legally insane, unable to appreciate the criminality of his conduct or conform his conduct to the requirements of the law. On June 21, 1982, the jury delivered a verdict that stunned and outraged the public. Not guilty by reason of insanity. Hinckley was not sent to prison. He was committed to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, a psychiatric facility in Washington, D.C. The public outcry was immense. The idea that someone could shoot the president and for other people and get away with it was incomprehensible to many. The verdict led directly to a massive overhaul of laws governing the insanity defense in the United States. In 1984, Congress passed the Insanity Defense Reform Act, which significantly tightened the rules, shifting the burden of proof to the defense and making it much more difficult to successfully use an insanity defense in federal court. John Hinckley Jr. would spend the next 34 years at St. Elizabeth's. He was eventually granted incremental freedoms, and in 2016, at the age of 61, he was granted full-time release to live with his elderly mother in Williamsburg, Virginia, under a strict set of conditions. The case of John Hinckley Jr. is a uniquely American story, sitting at the bizarre intersection of celebrity worship, mental illness, gun violence, and the porous line between media fantasy and reality. He was not a political assassin or a religious fanatic. He was a man with a hole in his soul who tried to fill it with a movie plot. He saw a fantasy of violent redemption and decided to reenact it on the world stage. His obsession was not truly with Jodie Foster the person, but with Jodie Foster the symbol, the iris he needed to complete his Travis Bickle persona. The assassination attempt was his ultimate act of cinematic plagiarism, a desperate bid for significance that failed to win him love, but succeeded in changing the law and scarring the lives of everyone he touched. Case 8. The Murder of Christina Grimmie. A tragedy of twisted admiration. The digital age has created a new kind of intimacy between celebrity and fan. Social media platforms like YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram allow for a direct, seemingly personal connection that was once impossible. Artists can speak directly to their followers, sharing their triumphs, their struggles, and their daily lives. This fosters a powerful sense of community and loyalty, but it can also create a fertile ground for obsession, blurring the lines between a supportive fan and a possessive stalker, between a parasocial relationship and a dangerous delusion. The tragic story of Christina Grimmie is a heartbreaking illustration of how this new intimacy, designed to bring people closer, can be twisted by a sick mind into a justification for the ultimate act of violence. Christina Victoria Grimmie was a product of this new digital era. She was born in 1994 in New Jersey, a girl with a powerhouse voice and a preternatural talent for music. In 2009, at the age of 15, she began posting videos of herself on YouTube, singing covers of popular songs while playing the piano in her bedroom. Her channel, Zeldaxlove64, quickly became a sensation. There was an authenticity to her, a raw, undeniable talent combined with a goofy, girl-next-door charm. She wasn't a manufactured pop star. She was a real person sharing her gift with the world. Her audience grew exponentially. She became one of YouTube's first true music stars, amassing millions of subscribers and hundreds of millions of views. Her fans, who she affectionately called her Frans, a portmanteau of friends and fans, felt a deep, personal connection to her. They had watched her grow up on screen. They had supported her journey from her bedroom to touring with major acts like Selena Gomez. In 2014, she took her career to the next level, competing on the 6th season of the NBC reality singing competition, The Voice. Her blind audition, a stunning rendition of Miley Cyrus's Wrecking Ball, caused all 4 celebrity coaches to turn their chairs. She chose to be on Adam Levine's team and ultimately finished in 3rd place. But her performances had introduced her incredible talent to a massive mainstream audience. She had successfully transitioned from YouTube star to a legitimate, rising force in the music industry. Throughout her rise, Christina remained deeply committed to the very thing that had made her famous: her connection with her fans. She was known for her kindness, her generosity, and her accessibility. After her shows, she would almost always hold meet-and-greet sessions. These weren't rushed, impersonal events. She would spend time with each fan, hugging them, signing autographs, taking photos, and genuinely listening to them. She saw them as the reason for her success, and she treated them with gratitude and love. This open, trusting nature was central to her identity. It was also the vulnerability that her killer would exploit. That killer was Kevin James Loibl. Born in 1989, Loibl was a 27-year-old from St. Petersburg, Florida, who lived a life of quiet isolation. He worked a low-wage job as a Best Buy Geek Squad technician and had few, if any, friends. His coworkers described him as a loner, a man who lived almost entirely inside his own head. Like so many others before him, he filled the void in his life with an obsession. His obsession was Christina Grimmie. Loibl's fixation was not that of a typical fan. It was a deep, all-consuming delusion. He spent hours on his work computer watching her YouTube videos, tracking her social media, and immersing himself in every aspect of her life. He reportedly bragged to coworkers that he was going to marry her one day. He saw her not as a performer, but as his future wife. In his mind, they had a relationship. He underwent a physical transformation to make himself more attractive to her, getting hair transplants and LASIK eye surgery. He even became a vegan, reportedly because he thought she was one. He was molding himself into the man he believed she would want. His coworkers tried to gently reality check him. When they showed him pictures of Christina with her rumored boyfriend, her producer Stephen Reza, Loibl became intensely angry. The idea that she could have a life, a relationship that didn't involve him was a direct assault on his fantasy. This is a critical turning point in the stalker's psyche. When the carefully constructed delusion is threatened by reality, the response is not to adjust the fantasy, but to lash out at the source of that reality. His obsession, confronted with this unwelcome truth, began to metastasize into something darker. He decided he had to meet her. But his goal was not to get an autograph or a photo. His goal was to unite with her. And if he couldn't have her, no one would. In the weeks leading up to his attack, his plan began to form. He legally purchased two 9mm Glock handguns and a tactical knife. He had no criminal record, so the purchase was easy. He bought a ticket to one of her shows. On June 10, 2016, Christina Grimmie was in Orlando, Florida, performing at the Plaza Live Theater with the band Before You Exit. It was the kind of intimate venue she loved, a place where she could be close to her fans. Kevin Loibl drove from his home in St. Petersburg to Orlando, a 2-hour trip. He was armed with his 2 handguns, 2 full magazines of ammunition, and a large hunting knife. The security at the venue was tragically lax. There were no metal detectors. Unarmed guards performed only rudimentary bag checks. Loibl, carrying his arsenal, was able to walk into the theater without any problem. After the show, as was her custom, Christina went to the merchandise table in the lobby to meet her fans. A line of about 120 people had formed, all of them excited for a moment with their idol. Christina was there with her arms open, smiling, ready to give out hugs. Kevin Loibl stood in that line, waiting his turn. a killer hiding in plain sight among the fans. When Loibel reached the front of the line, Christina greeted him with a wide smile and opened her arms to hug him, as she had done for countless fans before. It was a gesture of pure, open-hearted welcome. Loibel did not embrace her. Instead, he pulled out one of the Glock handguns and fired 3 times at point-blank range. 1 bullet hit her in the head. 2 hit her in the chest. She collapsed to the floor. The sound of the gunshots sent the lobby into a state of panic. But in that moment of chaos, Christina's older brother, Mark Grimmy, who had been standing nearby, acted with incredible bravery. Without hesitation, he tackled Loibel, trying to subdue him and prevent him from harming anyone else. During the struggle, Loibel managed to break free. He backed against a wall, pulled out his second handgun, put it to his own head, and fired, killing himself instantly. Christina was rushed to the Orlando Regional Medical Center, but her injuries were catastrophic. She was pronounced dead shortly after arriving. Christina Grimmie, the vibrant YouTube star with the voice of an angel, was dead at 22 years old. The murder sent a shockwave of grief through the music community and her millions of fans worldwide. The hashtag RIP Christina became a global trending topic on Twitter. The story was a chilling testament to the dark side of fan culture in the digital age. Christina had built her career on a foundation of openness and trust with her fans. Her killer used that very openness as his weapon. He walked into her embrace and murdered her. The investigation into Loibel's motives revealed a classic, if modern, stalker's profile. He was an erotomanic, a man suffering from the delusion that this person he had never met was in love with him. Police found no evidence that Loibel and Grimmie had ever had any contact before the murder. He was a complete stranger to her, yet in his mind, they were destined to be together. When that fantasy was threatened by the reality of her having her own life, his love twisted into a murderous rage. His final act was one of ultimate possession and destruction. It was a murder-suicide pact she had no knowledge of. He had decided that if he couldn't have her in this life, he would join her in death, a final horrifying act of connection. Christina Grimmie's death was a brutal wake-up call for the music industry, particularly for independent artists and those who had risen through social media. It exposed the terrifying security gaps at small venues and the unique dangers faced by performers who cultivate a close, personal relationship with their audience. In the aftermath, many artists reevaluated their security protocols. Meet and greets, once a casual, joyful post-show ritual, became more structured, more guarded, with more distance between the artist and the fan. The innocent trust that had defined Christina's relationship with her fans was shattered. The tragedy of Christina Grimmie is a story about the collision of two worlds. One was a world of light, talent, and genuine connection. A world Christina had built with her music and her open heart. The other was a world of dark, isolated obsession, a world that existed only in the mind of Kevin Loibel. Her murder is a painful reminder that in an age of unprecedented access, where the line between public and private life is increasingly blurred, admiration can curdle into a deadly sense of ownership. She was killed not by a hater, but by a fan whose love was so twisted and possessive that he believed he had the right to extinguish her light simply because he could not own it. Case 9. The attack on Teresa Saldana and the fight against stalking. Before the laws were written, before the crime even had a name recognized by the courts, there were the victims. They were the unwilling pioneers who navigated a terrifying landscape of obsession with no map and no legal shield. They were told it was a private matter, that they were overreacting, that nothing could be done until it was too late. Long before the murder of Rebecca Schaeffer forced a national reckoning, another actress stared into the abyss of a stalker's madness and, through sheer will, survived to become the architect of her own justice. Her name was Teresa Saldana, and her story is not just one of survival, but of a fierce, transformative fight to ensure no one else would have to walk that path alone and unprotected. Teresa Saldana was a vibrant spark in the Hollywood of the early 1980s. A Brooklyn native with a fiery energy and a talent that was both raw and refined, she had earned critical acclaim for her role as the wife of Joe Pesci's character in Martin Scorsese's boxing masterpiece, Raging Bull. The film was a cultural phenomenon, and her performance had put her on the map. She was a working actress, landing roles in films and television, her career on a steady upward trajectory. She was 27 years old, living in West Hollywood, filled with the promise of a bright future. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, in a gray, dreary flat in Aberdeen, Scotland, a man named Arthur Richard Jackson was living in a world of his own dark design. Jackson was a 46-year-old drifter, a paranoid schizophrenic whose life was a litany of failures and resentments. He was a man untethered from reality, and he had found his anchor in a bizarre and deadly delusion. He became obsessed with Teresa Saldana after seeing her in the film Defiance. But Jackson's obsession was not the erotomania of a fan who believed he was loved from afar. It was something far more sinister, cloaked in a messianic fervor. In his fractured mind, he had been chosen by a higher power for a divine mission. He believed it was his destiny to kill Teresa Saldana and then be executed by the state. This act, he thought, would usher her into a better life in the hereafter, where they would be united forever. He was not a fan seeking connection. He was a self-styled angel of death, tasked with delivering her soul to a kingdom of his own imagining. He wrote about his mission in a diary, a chilling manifesto of his intent. "The transaction will be quick and clean," he wrote. "She is to die, I am to die, and we may be united in heaven." To carry out his divine transaction, he needed to find her. In late 1981, he sold his few possessions, withdrew his life savings, and flew to the United States. He was a man with a singular, terrible purpose. But how does a stranger from Scotland find a specific person in the sprawling metropolis of Los Angeles? Jackson's method exposed a terrifying loophole in the system, a vulnerability that would become a central theme in the fight against stalking. He hired a private investigator. For a small fee, the PI did exactly what Robert Bardo would do years later. He contacted the California Department of Motor Vehicles. At the time, this was a routine and perfectly legal transaction. The PI obtained the home address of Teresa's mother. The first link in the chain was forged. Jackson then made a phone call. He dialed the number for Teresa's mother, but he did not identify himself as Arthur Jackson, the drifter from Scotland. He claimed to be an assistant to the famed director Martin Scorsese, saying he needed to contact Teresa about a film role in Europe. It was a brilliant and diabolical piece of social engineering. The mother, excited by the prospect of such a major opportunity for her daughter, and having no reason to suspect otherwise, readily gave him Teresa's home address and phone number. The final link was in place. The system, built on a presumption of good faith, had delivered Teresa Saldana directly into the hands of her would-be killer. For weeks, Jackson stalked her. He watched her apartment. He learned her routine. He was a shadow she never knew was there, waiting for the moment ordained by the voices in his head. That moment came on the morning of March 15, 1982. Teresa was leaving her West Hollywood apartment, getting into her car to head to a music class. As she settled into the driver's seat, Jackson appeared as if from nowhere. He lunged at her through the open car door. She didn't even see the knife at first. She just felt a strange, cold whooshing sensation, followed by an unimaginable pain. Arthur Jackson was plunging a 5.5-inch hunting knife into her torso, again and again and again. It was an act of shocking, frenzied brutality. He was not trying to scare her or wound her. He was methodically executing his mission. He stabbed her in the chest, the lungs, the diaphragm, and the heart. The attack was silent, relentless, and utterly without mercy. Teresa, fighting for her life with a primal instinct she didn't know she possessed, began to scream. Her screams shattered the morning quiet. And then, something happened that does not always happen in these stories. A hero emerged. A man named Jeff Fenn, a delivery driver for Arrowhead Water, was working his route nearby. He heard the screams, saw the brutal attack unfolding, and did not hesitate. He ran toward the car, shouting. His intervention startled Jackson, breaking his concentration. Jackson pulled away from Teresa and turned his attention to the approaching man. Fenn, a man of remarkable courage, confronted the armed attacker. He managed to grab the knife from Jackson's hand and subdue him, pinning him to the ground until police arrived. Jeff Fenn's bravery, his simple, decent choice to intervene rather than turn away, is the reason Teresa Saldana's story does not end on that bloody sidewalk. He saved her life, but her life was hanging by the thinnest of threads. When paramedics arrived, she was clinically dead. They found no pulse, no blood pressure. The 10 stab wounds had caused catastrophic internal damage and massive blood loss. They rushed her to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, where an emergency room team, led by a surgeon named Dr. Michael McGonigal, began a desperate 4-hour operation to save her. They literally brought her back from the dead, restarting her heart and transfusing more than double her body's volume of blood. Her survival was a medical miracle, but her ordeal was far from over. She spent months in the hospital, enduring multiple surgeries and excruciating pain. The physical scars were horrific, but the psychological wounds were just as deep. She was plagued by terror, by nightmares, by the constant, paralyzing fear that he would come back to finish the job. She was a survivor, but she was also a prisoner of her own trauma. Arthur Richard Jackson's trial was swift. There was no question of his guilt. His diary, his own words, laid his intent bare. He was convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 12 years in prison, the maximum allowed at the time. He served his time and was then deported back to the United Kingdom in 1996. The story should have ended there, but it didn't. In 1997, in a horrifying epilogue that proved the depth of his psychosis, he was convicted in the UK for the murder of a former psychiatric nurse. He died in a British high-security psychiatric hospital in 2004, his divine mission having finally claimed a life. For Teresa Saldana, his imprisonment was not enough. The attack had exposed a terrifying vulnerability not just in her own life, but in society itself. She had been stalked and nearly murdered, yet in 1982, there was no legal framework to describe what had happened to her. There were no specific anti-stalking laws. There were no protections for victims. Her privacy had been violated by a government agency, the DMV, which had sold her information to a man who used it to try to kill her. She realized that her story was not just her own. It was a warning. And so, Teresa Saldana, the actress, became Teresa Saldana, the warrior. She refused to hide. She refused to be a silent victim. She channeled her pain and her terror into a new mission, one of advocacy. She founded one of the nation's first victim advocacy organizations, Victims for Victims. She became a powerful public voice for those who had been terrorized by stalkers. She took her fight to the state and federal level. She lobbied lawmakers, telling her story again and again, forcing them to confront the reality of this insidious crime. Her case, along with others, became a major catalyst for change. It was a crucial building block in the movement that would, after the murder of Rebecca Schaefer 7 years later, finally lead to the passage of the nation's first anti-stalking law in California in 1990. Even more directly, Her case was instrumental in the creation of the 1994 Federal Drivers Privacy Protection Act, DPPA. This landmark legislation, a direct response to the way both she and Rebecca Schaefer had been located, made it illegal for state DMVs to sell the private information of citizens. She had identified the exact systemic failure that had almost cost her her life, and she fought until that loophole was closed forever. Teresa Saldana eventually returned to acting, her career forever redefined by the attack. She even played herself in a television movie about her ordeal, Victims for Victims, the Teresa Saldana story, a courageous act of reclaiming her own narrative. She passed away in 2016 from pneumonia, but her legacy is monumental. She was one of the first to give a name and a public face to the crime of stalking. She was a woman who was brutally attacked, brought to the brink of death, and came back not with vengeance, but with a fierce determination to protect others. She took the darkest moment of her life and transformed it into a shield for countless people she would never meet. Her story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and a powerful reminder that while one person's obsession can seek to destroy, one person's courage can change the world. Case 10. The Alice Ruggles Case. When love turns to deadly control. In the digital age, the tools of the stalker have evolved. The obsessive mind no longer needs to stand in the shadows across the street or rely on private investigators and outdated government records. The modern stalker operates from the palm of their hand, using the very technologies designed for connection: social media, messaging apps, GPS tracking as instruments of terror and control. Their harassment is a relentless, 24/7 assault, a digital siege that invades every corner of the victim's life until there is no safe space left. The tragic case of Alice Ruggles is a chilling anatomy of this new form of stalking, a story that reveals how a seemingly modern romance can devolve into a terrifying campaign of coercive control that culminates in the most ancient and brutal of crimes. Alice Ruggles was a vibrant, intelligent, and much-loved young woman from Leicestershire, England. In 2016, at 24 years old, she was just beginning to build her life. She had graduated from Northumbria University with a degree in philosophy and French and had landed a good job at the broadcasting company Sky in Newcastle. She was independent, funny, and had a wide circle of close friends. She was, by all accounts, a bright light, full of potential and excitement for the future. In 2015, she met Lance Corporal Trimon Harry Dillon. He was a soldier in the 2nd Scots Regiment of the British Army, stationed at a barracks near Edinburgh. On the surface, he was a catch. He was handsome, confident, and had the distinguished air of a military man. They met online, and their initial courtship was a whirlwind of romantic gestures. He showered her with attention, and they quickly fell into what seemed to be a passionate and serious relationship. But from the beginning, there were signs that something was wrong. Dillon's charm was a thin veneer over a deeply insecure and controlling personality. His passion was not love. It was possession. He began to undermine Alice's confidence, subtly at first, then more overtly. He criticized her appearance, her friends, her past relationships. He was intensely jealous and paranoid, constantly accusing her of cheating. He would check her phone, monitor her social media, and try to isolate her from her friends and family. He demanded to know where she was and who she was with at all times. Alice, like so many victims of coercive control, found herself trapped in a confusing cycle. Dillon would lash out with jealousy and accusations, and then follow it with tearful apologies and grand romantic gestures, promising to change. She began to feel that his intense jealousy was a sign of how much he loved her. She was walking on eggshells, constantly trying to manage his moods and avoid triggering an outburst. The confident, happy young woman was slowly being eroded, her world shrinking to accommodate his demands. After about a year, Alice found the strength to end the relationship. She realized that what she was experiencing was not love, but a toxic form of control. But for Harry Dillon, the relationship was not over just because she said it was. Her decision to leave was not an end. It was an act of defiance that his controlling psyche could not tolerate. He refused to accept her decision. This is when his behavior escalated from coercive control within the relationship to a full-blown stalking campaign. The tools he used were modern, but the terror they inflicted was timeless. He began a relentless digital and physical assault. He bombarded her with hundreds of emails, voicemails, WhatsApp messages alternately begging her to take him back and threatening her. He hacked into her social media accounts, posting messages as if he were her, trying to maintain the illusion that they were still together. He then began to use his military training to his advantage. He would make the 120-mile drive from his barracks in Edinburgh to Newcastle in the middle of the night. He would stand outside her ground-floor apartment, taking pictures of it and leaving them on her windowsill. On one occasion, he left flowers and a box of Ferrero Rocher chocolates. But a note he left with them was not romantic. It was menacing. He was letting her know that he could get to her whenever he wanted, that she was not safe, even in her own home. He was a ghost at her window, a constant, unseen presence. Alice was terrified. She felt like she was being watched all the time. The man she had once loved had become her tormentor. She did what she was supposed to do. She went to the police. On October 1, 2016, she contacted the Northumbria police and reported Dillon's behavior. An officer contacted Dillon's barracks and spoke with him, warning him to have no further contact with Alice. Dillon was issued a police information notice, PIN, a formal warning that his behavior could amount to harassment. To Alice and to the police, it seemed that the matter was resolved. Dillon had been warned off by an official authority figure, but this action had the opposite of its intended effect. For a controlling personality like Dillon, the police warning was not a deterrent. It was a challenge to his authority. It was a humiliation. He had been told no by Alice, and now he was being told no by the police. His sense of control was completely gone, and his obsession curdled into a cold. Venja matched her as she moved out of their shared apartment, a silent, menacing presence. He hacked into her social media accounts. He created fake profiles to monitor her online activity. The digital tools meant for connection became his weapons of surveillance. He then began to use his military skills to terrorize her in the physical world. He was a signals expert in the army, trained in surveillance and intelligence gathering. He would make the 120-mile drive from his barracks in Edinburgh to her new flat in Gateshead, often in the middle of the night. He would leave chocolates and flowers on her windowsill, not as a romantic gesture, but as a chilling message. I know where you live. I can get to you. He would knock on her door and then disappear before she could answer. He was a ghost she could not escape. Alice was living in a state of constant fear. She felt like she was being watched, that she had no privacy, no safe space. She changed her phone number, but he got it from one of their mutual friends by lying and saying Alice had asked him to. He began to contact her friends and family, trying to turn them against her, painting himself as the heartbroken victim. It was a classic campaign of psychological warfare. On October 1, 2016, Alice did exactly what she was supposed to do. She contacted the Northumbria police. She gave them a detailed account of the harassment, the constant messages, the unwanted visits. She told them she was terrified. The police officer who took her report made a fateful decision. Instead of arresting Dillon, the officer simply issued him with a police information notice, PIN, a formal but non-statutory warning to cease his behavior. Dillon was told to stop contacting her. For Dillon, this warning was not a deterrent. It was an intolerable humiliation. His authority had been challenged, first by Alice and now by the police. The last vestiges of his control were slipping away, and his obsessive mind twisted this rejection into a justification for rage. He sent Alice a final, chilling series of messages, including a photo of a letter from his commanding officer confirming the police complaint. He was furious that she had gotten him in trouble. On the evening of October 12, 2016, just 11 days after she had first contacted the police, Alice was at home. She had just returned from a trip and was messaging a friend. Her last message was sent at 6:04 p.m. Shortly after, Harry Dillon, who had driven from Edinburgh, broke into her apartment through her ground-floor bedroom window. What happened next was an act of unspeakable brutality. He confronted her in the bathroom. Armed with a long, sharp carving knife he had taken from her own kitchen, he attacked her. He slit her throat from ear to ear, with such force that the knife went all the way through to her spine. It was not a crime of passion. It was a methodical, savage execution. Alice's flatmate, Maxine McGill, came home from work to a scene of unimaginable horror. The front door was locked from the inside. When she finally got in through the back, she found Alice's body on the bathroom floor in a pool of blood. She immediately called 999. In the harrowing recording of that call, Maxine's voice is a scream of raw terror and grief. "She's dead," she cries. "She's been murdered." Harry Dillon had fled the scene, taking Alice's phone and the murder weapon with him in an attempt to cover his tracks. But his escape was short-lived. Police tracked him back to his barracks in Edinburgh and arrested him later that night. In his room, they found Alice's blood-soaked phone. His trial was a showcase of his manipulative personality. He pleaded not guilty, crafting a fantastical story of self-defense. He claimed that Alice had attacked him with the knife, that she had been suicidal, and that in the struggle, she had accidentally fallen on the knife, slitting her own throat. He portrayed himself as the victim, a man who had only ever loved her. The jury did not believe a word of it. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The forensic evidence, the history of stalking, the testimony of Alice's friends and family, it all painted a clear picture of a narcissistic, controlling man who, when he could no longer possess the woman he claimed to love, chose to annihilate her. The prosecution argued that the murder was his final act of control. In April 2017, Trimon Harry Dillon was found guilty of the murder of Alice Ruggles and sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 22 years. The murder of Alice Ruggles sent shockwaves across the UK. It was a case that starkly highlighted the failures of the system to protect victims of stalking and the often fatal link between stalking and murder. The police handling of the case came under intense scrutiny. Why was a formal warning considered a sufficient response to such a clear and terrifying pattern of behavior? Why wasn't he arrested when Alice first reported him? The case became a catalyst for change, leading to calls for better police training in identifying and managing the risks of stalking and coercive control. In the wake of their devastating loss, Alice's family, her parents, Clive and Sue, and her siblings did not retreat into their grief. They became powerful advocates, founding the Alice Ruggles Trust. Their mission is to raise awareness of stalking, to ensure that lessons are learned from Alice's death, and to help prevent what happened to her from happening to others. They have worked tirelessly to promote education on the dangers of coercive control and to campaign for better legal protections for victims. The case of Alice Ruggles is a profoundly modern tragedy. It demonstrates how the tools of our interconnected world can be weaponized by a controlling mind. Dillon's stalking was not just a series of isolated incidents. It was a relentless campaign, a slow, terrifying tightening of a noose. His love was not affection. It was a claim of ownership. When Alice asserted her fundamental right to be free, He saw it not as a breakup, but as a betrayal punishable by death. Her story is a heartbreaking but vital lesson, that in the landscape of modern relationships, the most dangerous threats often begin not with a fist, but with a text message, and the words "I love you" can become the prelude to "you will not leave me." And so, our journey through the stalker's psyche comes to a close. From the glitz of Hollywood to the quiet suburbs, from the intimacy of a shared home to the cold distance of a digital connection, the stories are different, but the pathology is the same. It is a story of obsession, of control, and of a fantasy so powerful it devours reality. We have seen how love can be twisted into possession, admiration into rage, and a human being into an object to be claimed or destroyed. The lives of Rebecca, Dominique, John, Selena, Teresa, Christina, and Alice, and the countless others whose names we do not know, were not ended by monsters from a horror film. They were ended by ordinary people consumed by an extraordinary sickness, a sickness that our society is still learning how to recognize and how to stop. Thank you for joining us at the Crime Folio. Sleep well, and try not to dream of the shadows that watch from a distance. Good night.